from Professor Gilchrist's presentation, and I'm really pleased to be following her because she's helpfully sort of mapped out some of the more sort of theoretical aspects that I'll be providing some practical examples or narratives with respect to. So hopefully you'll see that there's a great deal of resonance across the two presentations, and hopefully it'll help concretize some of our discussions this morning. So I want to focus on what it means in terms of your entitlements to certain services in society when you have a victimized status, or even when you're a perpetrator, although my work for now is focused primarily on victims. And I'm trying to understand sort of the qualitative experiences and help-seeking patterns among ethnic minority and immigrant victims. And for the purposes of the study that I conducted, I looked at Hong Kong and the UK, mainly the cities really, so Greater London area and Hong Kong, to provide sort of a comparative perspective, because we share such similar legal systems, but also our framework of governance and policy is largely drawn from the way in which the structure is set up in the United Kingdom. The analysis I've tried to frame in terms of the Hong Kong government's obligations under the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, so it's a CEDAW framework, and its obligations to deliver on equal protection under the law to all people, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, and other minority status, but also going back to something that Professor Gilchrist said, that it's not just about culture, but it's the broader framework of factors that are enablers or disenablers in terms of access. So the findings reveal an institutional level of incompetence or systemic failures and certain sort of inadequacies which result in particular groups of women falling through what I'm calling the justice gap. I seek to ground the recommendations that stem from this research in the context of human rights because of the reasons I've just mentioned. When you have a systemic failure and you look at international obligations and the laws that we have, it's important to sort of frame the analysis to pinpoint whose responsibility is it then to fix part of the problem. Because when you locate responsibility, you then start having resource allocation and then the requisite training and mapping out the necessary interventions. So to some extent, there is an important aspect to sort of framing it in this way. Not only are states required to protect the rights of all women and all persons within their jurisdictions, but to do so equally and equally effectively. So in that sense, there's an obligation of due diligence to ensure that not just individual circumstances of violence are subject to criminal laws, but also violence perpetrated in the private sphere is also brought to justice under appropriate laws. And so, of course, we all recognize that domestic violence is different from the violence that you encounter at the hands of strangers. And because of the intimate context, you struggle with how to deal with that violence. And, of course, we understand that we shun the role and relevance of the law when it comes to the personal sphere for a number of reasons, as we'll see, but particularly some of the factors that Professor Gilchrist touched on in terms of immigration, the children, in-laws, and your wider culture or community of people who you feel accountable to will also dissuade you from dealing with your issue of violence in a particular manner. But it is important to take a systematic lens so that you can address the barriers that are converging to make certain women even more vulnerable than the ordinary women in Hong Kong who might be at risk of violence. And the figures in Hong Kong are quite reflective of the global figures of the problem. 1 in 3 women have, at some point or the other, experienced either sexual or domestic violence at the hands of a person that they know. So it's not stranger-based violence, it's mostly people that we know. So in terms of framing it within the context of the CEDAW Convention, the articles focus on achieving equality and non-discrimination for women in all spheres of life, and the argument is that without freedom from violence, you're not able to enjoy access to any of these other rights, whether it's education, legal rights, rights to personality, or reproductive rights and autonomy. And that is the reason why you do have to focus on equal access. Article 5 of CEDAW singles out the impact of all cultural factors, particularly patriarchy, as an equality barrier in the systemic sense to women's enjoyment of human rights equally. Feminist critique of institutional cultures, particularly of institutions such as the law, is that the law is inherently masculine. So even the framing of the law makes certain assumptions about individuals that are masculine in nature. And that also affects how effective these provisions are to help women. So for example, we make various assumptions about victims and their accessibility to frameworks for protection, which I'll talk about in a moment. I also want to highlight the Declaration for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which was enacted in 1993. It's not a convention, but it really effectively sort of lays out the duty that is on state parties under Article 4, which says that states must not only condemn violence by exercising due diligence in their implementation of an adequate framework to prevent, protect, prosecute, punish, and provide reparations for victims in the public and private sphere, but they must also develop comprehensive strategies to address violence at all levels, including in the legal aspects. So courts need to do what they do properly, but also politically and administratively and culturally, measures need to be in place to ensure that violence at all levels is duly addressed. And particularly, the provision singles out the need to guard against re-victimization of victims because of these failures. Intersections theory has called into question the one-size-fits-all approach, which underscores the protective framework of most countries, and Hong Kong and UK not to be singled out in that respect. We too have a generic one-size-fits-all approach for the most part, but the application of an intersectional analysis to the experience of victims of domestic violence promptly reveals that not all women are in the position to access these mechanisms, and the effectiveness of the measures depend predominantly on individual user capacities, but also what I call internal factors, which might be culture, religion, and value frameworks, but also external factors such as financial dependence on the abuser, a lack of employment status, a lack of social mobility in a city, for example. So many of the women would not have phones or might not know how to take transport to areas of service. So factors which I'm calling external factors, such as immigration, financial, and other barriers, that impact their social competence to receptivity or accessibility to help measures. So failure to account for these renders this group of people particularly vulnerable to becoming entrenched in a situation of violence. So it's not just one-off experiences of violence, but how you become stuck in a cycle of violence, and that affects what you choose to, or what you think you can do about it going forward. So understanding the lived realities and experiences at each occasion of violence, and how all of these factors actually grip the woman's sort of experience to impact what she's going to do next, is really, really important to understand that, and then devise appropriate interventions accordingly. So the research basically sought to look at the lived experiences by drawing on women's narratives and to identify prevalent measures and interventions at the moment, and then to see what kind of transformative justice recommendations can be made by focusing on the due diligence obligation of the state, so that those of us in the field can have the tools and develop the tools necessary to implement a more effective regime of interventions. So we do need to challenge, as Professor Gilchrist said, our laws, our structures, our frameworks, and figure out how we can be better informed about doing this work. I'm not going to go too much in depth into the methodology, except to highlight that I'm going to be speaking about social workers that I interviewed, and also healthcare professionals, police from the UK, not from Hong Kong, and predominantly ethnic minority and immigrant women, both victims and non-victims. I was keen to compare what the perception and knowledge levels are between the victim group and the non-victim group across both countries. In terms of literature review, we know that various studies have highlighted the fact that individual capacities do impact victims' experiences and help-seeking behavior, but the role of ethnicity is limited in this broader picture, and this is what I've sought to sort of add to in terms of the literature, by identifying the specific personal barriers or competence-related capacities that we should be focusing on. So these are the assumptions I wanted to draw your attention to in terms of the existing framework. We think about anticipated or logical responses of women to domestic violence. So, for example, she's going to be able to recognize that what's happening to her is abusive behavior. But, for example, rape within marriage is not necessarily considered rape by all people because they feel there's an entitlement to sex on the part of the male partner as and whenever they want, and then that they'll be able to take the necessary steps to initiate a complaint and seek the assistance of police or social services or healthcare. But the idea is that essentially victims need to be recognized as responding to violence uniquely depending on their circumstances. So in terms of awareness of legal rights, I found that predominantly the women were under-aware of the fact that there were laws against, for example, their equal protection on grounds of race, but also on grounds of being a woman, so equality rights. They were also unaware of the fact that domestic violence was a crime at the time of the abuse, and their level of knowledge regarding laws in general and the system was quite poor. But comparatively, the UK victims seem to be doing better than the Hong Kong counterparts. You can see from the statements the kinds of worries that impact women's decisions are, for example, she didn't want to call the police because she wasn't sure if she'd acted in self-defense and inflicted harm on the perpetrator, then she thought she would be subject to an arrest as well. And another woman had the same fear, felt that she couldn't leave her children behind. So what would happen? The uncertainty made her less sure that this is the step she wanted to take. And then, of course, the immigration barrier. So even though she knew it was wrong, she was worried about her visa status, and she didn't know if that would land her in trouble or being separated from her children. Perceptions of law and authority, the level of satisfaction that the women had towards the legal system. Again, these are scores out of 5, so we're not doing terribly well. But you can see that in Hong Kong, the victim group is less satisfied than the non-victim groups in terms of the rights of the innocent and the ability of the system to help determine the guilt of the accused. In the UK, you can see that there's a very low level of confidence in terms of underrepresented litigants. But on the whole, in the UK, the experience seems to be that the victims have greater satisfaction levels and better perceptions of law and authority compared to the non-victims. This is important because it means that if people who've not been victimized yet have a perception that they're not going to be dealt with the system effectively, then this would impact their access to the system and the likelihood that they would seek assistance in the first place. I just want to highlight that a lot of the sample for this particular question was drawn from the mainland Chinese women, and that might impact their vision of the Hong Kong legal system and how satisfied they were. Perhaps they're comparing it to what they see in terms of rule of law back home, so that's important to bear in mind. On the police satisfaction levels, again, you can see a similar pattern. There's a greater confidence and satisfaction with police protection on the part of victims in the UK compared to non-victims. You can see, in fact, it's quite stark. So 5 out of 5 for treating women, everyone fairly, but then the non-victims scored the police very poorly on treatment in terms of fairness. Whereas in Hong Kong, we see a similar pattern again, but the scores are much lower this time. The overall level of confidence, again, the victims are more confident than the non-victims, so lessons to be taken from there. Immigration status as a barrier. The no recourse to public funds rules, which Professor Gilchrist spoke about earlier, is important. So it sort of stands in the way of whether you can seek help, even if you do ask for assistance. Of course, you can call the police, but you won't get any access to shelters or particular resources. In Hong Kong, the majority of the victims chose to wait the 7-year period, which is the lead time required for concretizing your immigration status, before even complaining for the first time. So one of the women interviewed waited 6.5 years before she said anything to anybody here. But just also by way of comparison, she waited 15 years before telling her parents back home that she was now a divorced woman living alone in Hong Kong with her children. So that's the level of shame or resistance that might be brought on in terms of facing this experience, despite it being not her fault, but culturally to have that as a barrier. There's also the domestic violence concession rule in the context of the UK where you can raise that. But again, there's evidentiary burdens, as Professor Gilchrist mentioned. In Hong Kong, we have no such equivalent. So women's visa status will not necessarily be considered independently of the abuser's sponsorship, even if she shows that she's a victim of domestic violence. And the problem there, of course, is that because they depend on the abusers financially and in so many other ways, their fear primarily is that of their children being taken away from them. And so they choose their own sort of comfort versus their comfort of the children. And this tension between their own protection of themselves and then their child is constantly grating against them in terms of what they're going to do next. Substance abuse was found to be a problem for some of the participant sample in my group, but many of them found that there was no systematic approach to dealing with substance abuse as part of the framework in which violence was experienced. Some women complained that alcohol was often cited as an excuse by the husband. He was very apologetic, claimed no memory of what happened, expressed shock that he could be so brutal, and said, "I'm sorry, it won't happen again," only for it to recur several times over. And as a weakness, and not an intended sort of act of violence or sort of something that's orchestrated, but sort of a bad habit that he's having trouble kicking. And so, of course, I must be understanding and must be forgiving. And that leaves her trapped in that situation. So they don't identify it as a risk factor, as a problem, but rather see it as something that they have the responsibility to understand and help the husbands through. There's also a culture surrounding drinking in the sense that many of particularly the migrant or immigrant men who work very long hours would come home after their shift, and all they want to do is have a drink and relax. And the last thing you need is your wife nagging you and saying, "Stop drinking, you're over drinking, and you're going to get, you're going to become brash and violent." And so that's a big sort of, it's none of the wife's business if I want to sit down and have a drink with my friends, and so I'll get a little loud, and that's okay because I've earned it, it's my day. So that's the tendency, and so things sort of escalate, and you've got this in the mix, but none of the service providers interviewed felt able to deal with both. It was always either or. And in Hong Kong, especially for the cultural minorities, there was no sensitized program to be able to deliver either rehabilitation or other sort of preventive or intervening strategies in a culturally sensitive manner, or even in a language that was accessible to them. So if you don't speak English or Chinese, there was no substance abuse related program that could assist you. In terms of literature review and interventions of what other people were doing, I found in Australia and the UK, there were more coherent strategies and holistic approaches developed in terms of best practice models, which would be worth looking at and seeing how they integrate help-seeking and interventions for both domestic violence and substance abuse in that context to assist the family context as a whole, rather than just focusing on the victim and extracting her from the situation. In terms of framing help-seeking, again, external help is often seen as a measure of last resort. So a lot of the women being interviewed were the ones who sat on violence for several years before deciding to take, to seek help. And this is really important because if their first impression of seeking assistance is a negative one, then they're probably not going to return. And so social workers were complaining that when they sought to intervene, women would often disappear, and it was very hard to do follow-up work. But a lot of it stemmed from the fact that perhaps what they were recommending to the women was not a culturally appropriate intervention. So, for example, women would say, you need to that the social worker told her to file for divorce or separate from the husband if she was serious about applying for compassionate housing or getting help to relocate her children to different schools. So in a way, they came away with the message that help is conditional on my divorcing from my husband. And because that just culturally didn't fit their model of what they should be as a wife, because they defined their success as a woman as in terms of how good a wife they were, they felt, well, there's nothing here that can be helpful to me. So the attrition in terms of follow-up is directly attributable in part to the lack of a culturally sensitized approach, perhaps to asking the right questions and, mapping it slowly so that you can educate and help the woman along to get to a point where she may be ready to acknowledge that this is the only way to escape the violence permanently, or to find a solution that she can live with, because she's more than just a victim, right? She's the mother, the community member that she has ties to not only in Hong Kong, but also back home. So there are several factors of concern, and this is sort of reflected in a lot of the reasons they gave for not seeking help, particularly shame and honor, and I'm not going to emphasize that. There were also variations between the kind of barriers service providers highlighted compared to what the women themselves highlighted as barriers. And I particularly want to highlight that they thought lack of legal knowledge and language were some of the major barriers that women faced. And also in Australia, cultural perceptions of DV was highlighted. They underestimated the women's sort of lack of confidence in the legal systems. Women's help-seeking patterns, none of them sought medical attention in Hong Kong, but majority of them share with friends and family. They cited familiarity and a sense that somebody understood what they were saying without thinking they were crazy or had this, really conservative culture. They feared being judged in Hong Kong and both in the UK as well. So the options pursued tend to be very, very limited, but the majority were either indecisive or took no action or ultimately would go back to the abuser. Religious leaders were not a popular option, so seldom were they going back to their religious leaders for advice. So internal and external factors. Competence of agencies, the majority of them highlighted that they did not feel sufficiently capacitated to be able to handle the needs of ethnic minority women, but in general also they learned that they were not very well-versed in terms of legal knowledge. Especially alarming were their lack of knowledge on CEDAW, laws relating to equality, and DV-specific laws, particularly the service providers. And I think what's even more glaring is the fact that the victim women in Hong Kong were better informed about all of these than the service providers on the front line. So you can see consistently the knowledge gaps that are there can be detrimental in terms of devising a suitable safety plan for the women if they have no knowledge of what is the appropriate or possible course of action under the law. Quality of service. Women were generally critical of the services they received. They were not necessarily satisfied and thought there were several shortcomings and things could be improved. Language barrier is in Hong Kong at least the biggest barrier. So despite the availability of a real-time TransLink online immediate sort of translation service, the usage rate of this device in the last 6 years since it's been set up is 0%. So even though facilities and resources are there, for some reason victims aren't being given access to real-time translation. They experience discrimination and are very worried about that, oftentimes being told to go back to their home country if they don't like it here, or if they can't deal with divorce, then they may as well choose to live with the abusive situation and otherwise get over their culture, extract themselves. Social workers seem to display a tendency to be the gatekeepers of the public purse, so they didn't feel the women were entitled because they were immigrants. So they're short stay people, they're not permanent residents. Why should we waste public resources on this group of people? There was particularly problematic language in relation to mainland Chinese women who were coming to Hong Kong, and I think the sense of them drawing on the public's resources was particularly acute. Cultural competence. Hong Kong service providers underscored themselves and said that they did not feel relatively well equipped to deal with women's cultural issues. In terms of competence training, half of them were undergoing it, but half were not, and they cited a variety of reasons. But the most surprising one to me was that some of them thought it was not useful because they could never come to accept a minority person's perspective on the acceptability of certain solutions in response to violence. So this suggests to me a lot of a need for sort of training and education in the sort of mapping exercise of what kind of experiences a woman is going through as a victim, and how to better appreciate the role of culture in that context, and to want to learn about their cultural and social identities so that they can do their work better. The manuals I reviewed in terms of the training materials for cultural sensitivity, some of them themselves had stereotypical messages about particular communities, and that's not the idea behind cultural sensitivity training. So there's also sort of who's delivering the training, and is that being evaluated as well? So best practices. I found the Australian models to be quite significantly advanced and progressive in that their case management involved not only risk assessment and also looking at the culturally and linguistically diverse background and needs of the women, but also to provide childcare, counseling, financial assistance, look at the housing needs of the women, give them legal advice, and escort to relevant services whenever they needed it. But also one of the interesting thing about what they were able to do was to get everyone into one room with the victim. So she only had to share sort of her ordeal once, and everybody then conducted the mapping exercise together, rather than what we have here in Hong Kong and sometimes in the UK, where you're going to each agency to explain again and again and again your experience. And that has a real draining effect on the women concerned. And primarily, they don't have the time, especially if they're away from the abuser for a long period. They'd be suspected of being up to something, and that could be a source of retaliation as well. So this multi-disciplinary networking that was happening was seen to have very strong results for women and high rates of victim retention as well in working through their issues. There's some specialist agencies I looked at in the United Kingdom and found that because they were raising community awareness on one hand, they had a relationship with religious leaders and community leaders, there was a strong sense of trust. And also the victims felt a sense of familiarity with those groups. And they preferred going to these specialist agencies, for example, for Jewish women or for Kurdish women. There were, however, some victims saying, I prefer going somewhere where nobody is likely to know anything about me because I'm worried about gossip. So they wanted the option. So they didn't mind that there were specialist refuges and things like that. They thought it might be good, it might be empowering for some people, but for some people they felt, well, I don't want to have anything to do with anybody in my community because I know they're going to judge me. So giving women the power to choose by having a number of resources. In Hong Kong, there was a specialist agency focusing on rehabilitation for Nepalese drug offenders or drug abusers. And it was primarily sort of tailor-made by drawing on the expertise of big brothers who were former drug offenders themselves or ex-abusers. And they built on the positive sort of cultural values that they had and on the strengths of the people in terms of their affinity towards music. So this center used their interest in learning music as a way to help the users get over their addiction, but also worked with them to, develop lyrics and actually sort of a whole album with songs so that they had an outlet for their frustration, their violence, their addiction, and an ability to sort of recover by looking inward and reflecting on who they were and then who they became after getting over that addiction. And it's been a very successful model, which is not widely practiced, it's not widely known in Hong Kong, but was found to be very effective in the Nepalese community in terms of reducing the rates of recidivism in terms of offending. So it's important to debunk cultural myths and to think of it as baggage or barriers, but rather to understand and equip yourself so that you can develop better interventions rather than sort of stereotyping. So not problematizing culture, but seeing it as a tool which women can draw on for strength. So the conclusions are, as we can see, violence is culturally constructed, so are our responses. There is a legal obligation which extends to all of our roles as service providers on the front line, and we need to do a better job of understanding and mapping, the situation of the women concerned so that we can provide equal protection in fact. And this requires identifying various factors that disempower women. We do a knowledge review of our intake processes and identify different types of victims and their various needs so that we can move towards empowerment, raising awareness, and improving our attitudes and moving towards a rights-based approach to service provision. That's all I'll say for now. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions before we move on. Yes? Could you press the button in front of you, please? Sorry, I can't hear you. Would you mind to press the button?
Yeah, I am Kalyan Pokhrel and I am doing LLM Human Rights in EHKU. Yeah, I have three different aspects I want to ask, or I want certain further information from you. Whether the due diligence clause that has been infringed under the heading of so-called liberal society, the right to privacy, how the right to privacy has also undermined the domestic violence, that first one. And second one, whether the institutional mechanism which is supposed to address the domestic violence that is gender sensitive or not, whether the woman may feel quite comfortable to express her grievances before the women themselves, whether that factor has been addressed properly or not, that I want to ask if you have found from your study in
Sorry, which factor?
Yeah, the gender factor.
Gender.
Yeah, whether the representation of the woman in the redressal mechanism. Yeah, for example, if you are going to the police station, whether the such FIR is supposed to be considered, or the reporting, or the what the story is recorded by the woman themselves, or the woman's officer, or that may be the male, because that may be also the differentiate between how she express. That is the question. And the third one is the question of how the society thinks about for example, how many male members are in this seminar. That is also the matter of the representation, means the whether the domestic violence is the sole domain of the women, or that is the factor that should be mitigated or not. That I want to three different questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I'll take the second question first, because there is material in the slides, but I didn't get around to it. It's very, very important to recognize that there is the gender dimension. And in fact, in the narratives, we found often when women were calling the police would come. In one instance, for example, the police came and didn't even speak to the victim, because the father-in-law who was present opened the door and he spoke fluent Cantonese. So as a Punjabi woman, she couldn't speak English or Chinese very well. And the police got the entire account of what happened from the father-in-law, didn't bother cross-checking with her, didn't take her statement, and simply asked her to pack her things and said, "We're going to take you to a shelter." And the father-in-law told her, "Don't worry, it'll be okay, and you can come back when things have cooled down." So this woman had a young baby of just a few months old, and the police asked her to leave the baby behind because she was told she wouldn't have room in the shelter for the baby. So she left, believing sort of, that everybody has her best interests at heart. And it's been sort of more than 2 years now. She's never seen her baby. She doesn't have access to the baby. So she was misinformed both. Well, and the police didn't follow the protocol that they do have. So of course in Hong Kong we have a protocol. You must have an on-site interpreter. You must speak directly with the victim to ask, why did you call 999? And you must then take the requisite steps. But she was completely ill-advised. And language here was one barrier, but also advantage was taken of the fact that, well, the police then didn't have to deal with her and could just deal with whoever was easier to work with. So that's happened. Also, in terms of asking for women officers to come along, a number of women I interviewed said that they were often told that there's no female officer available on duty and that men would show up. And the men, in fact, the officers would ask questions that were quite insensitive or inappropriate. So say, well, where are your injuries? Show me. So it was very difficult for them to then proceed further because they thought, well, I have to show my injuries and I would rather show it to a female officer. So if none is available, I'll just ask him to go away and I'll deal with it later. And of course, they don't bother. So this is what I meant earlier when I said their first impressions are really important, because if that's what happens the first time, then they're not going to call the police again if they experience violence a second time. So there's definitely a lack of gendered sensitivity. And in fact, it came up at a hearing that we had in the Legislative Council recently, where, a lot of organizations working with women victims said that the police display a lack of gendered sensitivity towards the type of questions they ask, the setting they provide for victims to privately convey the details of their ordeal. It's just not done well enough, and more needs to be done there. In terms of men's roles, I completely agree with you. I think it's really sad that we don't often see enough men or male academics or what have you at discussions of this sort, because gender violence is not a woman's problem. And as Professor Gilchrist said, there are male victims of violence as well. And so clearly this is a problem that needs to be thought of more broadly. And we've got various initiatives. I mean, Hong Kong U has a He for She initiative where we're trying to enlist men in the fight for equality for women, but that's just a very small step on a long, long journey. But definitely men who are in a position of authority, who can do something about this, need to be better informed about the tools here. On due diligence and privacy, there is this tension, but of course, as we know from jurisprudence, the right to privacy cannot take priority over the right to safety of the person and right to life. Right? So there's always a balance that's got to be struck, and in terms of at least enforcing the law, it's seen to be as a matter of public interest. And so privacy concerns would have to be relegated to that broader public interest. Okay? Esther? No. Okay. Well, we have time for just one last question before we move on. Anybody? No? Good. Okay. So with that, I'd like to invite Professor